but look for that current, and where it's going to hit the hardest, again, on that piece of structure is most important. What's actually on the bottom isn't, okay? The actual cover that's on the bottom, that is not the most important part. Where that water's hitting the hardest is the most important part. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. And this month in June, we're talking about kind of a two-part deal. And really going through this, it made me realize just how similar um, they are, even though the depth you fish them in is very different. But for this technique of the month, we're talking about fishing places that the current is hitting. You know, really keying in on places that face into the current. The only difference is in the pick two more, we talked about two very different baits to use in these situations, really based on depth. Okay. One is going to be able to use in any depth of water. Truthfully, you could use it in shallow water, but you can also, what I'm primarily talking about it for is in deeper water, at least 10 down to even 30 feet or so. The other, Rocco, he only runs about 5 feet, so it's going to be sub 5 feet where you're going to be fishing it at. But really, this technique is focusing on places that the current is hitting hard. That's what this is talking about, hard hitting current for June. I think of this being a time most of the country is post-spawn. Some of the places obviously way up north, you all are still still fishing for spawning fish, smallmouth, especially on some of those Great Lakes and things like that. They certainly are still spawning up there. But for most of the country, our fish are pretty well done. We're getting into that summertime of the year, and places where bass are going to set up into that current. They're there to feed, which is a good thing for us as anglers. And you can take one of these two baits and should be able to find a place to apply it on about any body of water throughout the country. I think we're going to start with the square bill, start with the shallow end of this. And, I think of a lot of the places where this has been effective for me in the summer. And first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is river systems, whether that's Mississippi River system or the Arkansas River system. Even here in East Tennessee on the upper end of some of our lakes, where those rivers feed in, I have caught big bags of fish in the summertime on a square bill crankbait, and it can be really effective then. A big thing with fishing a crankbait in the summertime, whether that's a square bill, whether that's a medium runner, a DT10 or something, or it's a DT16, a DT20 out there in really deep water, the single biggest factor in the success of your crankbait fishing, in my opinion, in the summer is the speed. More so than the color, more so than the action. Speed is the biggest thing that's going to trigger more bites for you with a crankbait in the summertime. With that in mind, knowing we're wanting to fish places where there is current hitting very well and places hopefully where there's some cover. If you've got that combination of hard, fast hitting current running into a place that's got cover, you've really got yourself a good situation going on. I've caught a lot of fish just on a gravel bar or a place that's pretty clean, but the current's hitting it really hard. I've caught tons of fish off of places like that. A square bill crankbait isn't really necessary then because you don't have much to get hung on. But if you've got a place that's got a lot of wood or it's got really big chunky rock or riprap or something like that, and that current is bumping into it really hard, you need something like a square bill crankbait to be able to effectively fish through those areas, moving the bait quickly and generate those reaction bites. So that's a big, big key with this. Just looking for those places where that current's bumping into the hardest. Again, kind of touching on that, the emphasis and what matters the most. Number one, where the current hits the hardest is most important. If it's a gravel bar and that's where the current's bumping into, that's where I'm going to fish. If it's a riprap bank and that's where the current is hitting into the most, that's where I'm going to fish. If it's a bank that's littered with stumps or logs, but right where the current hits the hardest, that's where I'm going to fish. Way to kind of picture this. Imagine you've got a river flowing downstream, then you have an island sitting dead in the middle of that river. The very utmost point, very tip of that island where the current is running right straight into, that's going to be my starting place. That's where I expect the fish to be. So if that's in 2 feet of water or 22 feet of water, that is a spot that I'm going to key in on. So just keep that in mind. That's kind of the way my brain's working when I'm thinking current in the summertime, as far as where those fish are setting up. So on that shallow water part of it, that square bill crankbait is going to be the one that gets the nod. We'll go ahead and go over the rod, reel, and line setup for that. And you've probably heard me talk about the Bass Pro Crank and Stick, just a absolute favorite rod of mine, and I have caught a ton of bass on it. I've won a lot of money with this Bass Pro Crank and Stick. You know, it's something that's been really, really good for me. Fishing it on a Johnny Morris Platinum 6/8 to 1 gear ratio reel. And for that square bill for OG Rocco, I'm going to be throwing it on 14-pound XPS fluorocarbon line. And this particular rod is probably the best all-around go-to model, in my opinion, in that crank and stick lineup. It's a 7-foot medium heavy action rod. If you were going to pick one, the great thing with these is they're not real expensive compared to a lot of the other rods out there on the market. But if you were going to pick one, I would get the 7-foot medium heavy. It'll work for shallow baits, mid-depth baits, deep baits, small baits, big baits. Even a bladed jig works really, really well on that 7-foot medium heavy action in that crank and stick lineup. So now the other part, if the places, you know, on your body of water are deeper where that current bumps into, you know, maybe up the lake, you've got shallow stuff and that's where you're going to fish your Rocco at, but you've come back down the lake, this same pattern basically is going to work as you work your way down the lake. It's just that you're going to end up fishing a little bit deeper. So look for those points, look for those humps, look for those saddles, anything that stick out into and catch that current that's flowing down the main body of the lake. Those are going to be the places that you're looking for, but you're going to have to use something different to get down to where those fish are at. And that's a swim bait. For me, I like to fish a 1/2 or 3/4 ounce jig head on my swim bait when I'm fishing it like this. This is a Bass Pro Speed Shad. That's a 3.8 inch. That is probably the very smallest bait I'm going to go with this time of the year. The 4.8 is one I'm going to use a lot. I'll even step up to the 5-inch one. But I like that little bit bigger bait for the most part than I do when the water's colder. That bigger swim bait just seems to get more bites, honestly, as well as bigger bites. Definitely seem to come on that, you know, kind of what I'd call a medium, you know, slightly larger size swim bait in that, you know, 5-inch type stuff. But again, you know, with the square bill, I'm fishing stuff that's visual, stuff I can literally see with my own 2 eyes. With the swim bait, this is where I'm using my electronics more. I'm using my Lake Master mapping. I'm using 360. I'm using side imaging to get out and idle around on these places and look for those fish. You know, some bodies of water may only be in 12 feet. Some places it may be in 20. Some places it may be in 25. But I'm going to use my electronics to try to find exactly where those fish are sitting. But I'm going to use my mapping really to find that first and look for those places that extend way out into the lake and where I expect to be catching that current. Some bodies of water, that current's going to be more wind driven than it is power generation driven. So, you know, just keep that in mind too. If you've got a wind blowing across this way today, it may set the fish up over there better versus, you know, on a point on the opposite side of the lake. But look for that current, and where it's going to hit the hardest, again, on that piece of structure is most important. What's actually on the bottom isn't, okay? The actual cover that's on the bottom, that is not the most important part. Where that water's hitting the hardest is the most important part. Douglas Lake, prime example, quick little story time. You know, this lake, they draw it down every year, 40 plus feet or so. When I was really trying to learn deep fishing, you know, this is a place that tons of fish get caught deep in the summertime. You know, I don't want to call it it's not like a destination fishery for offshore fishing, but it's just well known. And June comes around, lots of schools of fish get out deep, and it's a good place to catch them. I struggled with it there for a long, long time because I didn't understand that what was actually on the bottom didn't really matter. I mean, a lot of the very best places to catch fish out in deep water on Douglas Lake have nothing, have zero cover, zero, you know, no stumps, no brush, no rock veins hardly even. Some places are almost as slick as this table, literally slick clay, and the fish pile up there by the hundreds. I mean, they get in big, big schools on places. There's just almost no cover down there. And it took me a long time to realize that that was the case, that the composition of the bottom was irrelevant. It was the fact of how the current actually contact of that piece of structure was truly what made the difference and what made places good versus what made places no good. And once I understood that, it really came down to just finding what bait, fit the situation best. And a lot of times that bait ended up being a swim bait. So the setup for that one, I like a Johnny Moore's Carbon Light rod and reel for this particular setup. I like that 7/6 medium heavy action rod. I do like that longer length. With this thing being heavy and being able to throw it out there, making a long cast with it, then letting it sink down 15, 20 feet deep, you have a lot of line out at that point in time. So that 7/6 medium heavy, it's a good long rod, fairly parabolic, so I'm able to, put a lot of heat on those fish and really load that rod well with the hook set, and it does really well that way. Kind of that medium speed reel, that 7.5 to 1 gear ratio, I'm able to slow it down, keep the bait down there good, but whenever you do get a bite, I'm able to take up enough line quickly to be able to drive that hook into the fish. And then 17-pound XPS fluorocarbon is what I use most of the time. I will drop down to 14 on occasion if I feel like I'm having problems with getting too much lift out of the bait. But usually on that 3/4 ounce head or so, 17-pound seems to be a good matchup with that. So, yeah, pretty standard setup for that swim bait. But just that little bit longer rod, that 7/6 definitely does well for out there. So, man, June can be a fantastic time to catch a lot of fish, to catch some big ones, but definitely focus on where that current is running right straight into. That's a big key to success this time of year.